Great. Well, sorry to break up such lively conversations. It was lovely to hear such a wonderful hubbub and all the networking going on in the room. So, noswetha, pawb a croeso cynnes iawn. Good evening to you all and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Landscape Institute Wales. LIW is the professional body for landscape architects, which aims to protect, enhance and conserve both the natural and built environment for the benefit of the public by promoting the arts and the sciences of landscape architecture. As most of you probably know, my name is Ruth Williams, and I'm very pleased to lead the Institute's policy work in Wales as one of my consultancy roles. I just need to make a few announcements before we begin. I'm assured that if the fire alarm sounds, that the staff here on site will guide us via the tannoy system for the building as to what to do. But I can see there is a green sign over that door for a fire exit, and obviously there's the main door we all came in just now. And probably most of you know that the toilets are just through the arched door there and around to your right. Now, this is one of a series of what we're calling Landscape Futures events, which the Landscape Institute is hosting right across the UK. There's recently been one in Scotland on the issue of tree health, and there's going to be another event in Northern Ireland shortly. And all these events are being filmed. As you can see, we have Geraint here, and they're going to be made available on the Landscape Institute's website for others to see. And indeed, if you want to go on to landscapeinstitute.org, then you can see the other events as they come forward. For those of you that wish to tweet, the hashtag is TalkLandscape. Now, our host and chair for this evening, Julie James AM, who is the Deputy Minister for Skills and Technology, was asked at short notice yesterday to lead a debate in the Senedd this afternoon for the government. Therefore, she is going to join us as soon as possible as when that debate concludes. So it falls to me to welcome you to this building of the National Assembly for Wales. And the NAW feels that the pierhead helped Wales forge its identity through water and fire, is the quote from their website, in the late 19th century. Today, under the guardianship of the National Assembly for Wales, its aim is to inform, involve and inspire a new generation to forge a Wales for the future. So that's why we're lucky enough to have this building for our debate this evening. So for our first look at our theme this evening of valuing our landscape, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Calvin Jones, who is a noted economist at Cardiff University. Thank you, Calvin.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Let me just check this. Yeah, apologies first. I am an economist. Getting an economist to talk about land is like getting a starfish to talk about Gothic architecture. But I am extremely grateful for the invitation. I even put a tie on. And for me, not getting paid and putting a tie on is an extremely rare event. So I hope Ruth appreciates the gravity, and here's my funeral tie, as you can see, the gravity of how I'm serious I'm taking this. And the reason I say the S is because I'm currently on a sabbatical and I'm looking at why poor places stay poor. Whenever I say that to anybody not Welsh, they say, pardon? And I say, poor places stay poor, or something like it. Why poor places stay poor. And this fits quite nicely with that area of investigation, so I've interrupted my beard growing to come and talk to you tonight. I'm going to try and do a few things in the 30 minutes I've got. I'm going to talk about why land is important and why we have forgotten over recent history, why it's important and how it's important. And I'm going to talk about why that status quo of how we view land and landscape is changing, and then just talk about our particular issues here in Wales. There's a reason for this slide, and the reason is that for the vast majority of human history, you know, the hundreds of thousands of years that something like Homo sapiens has existed, land was it was malleable. It was a resource that we might have used briefly and then moved on. We would have had no possessions, you know, until about 11,000 BC. We would not have stayed in the same place for more than maybe a day or two, maybe a little longer if there was a, you know, an orchard that was about to kind of drop its fruit, or a particularly kind of fertile hunting ground or gathering area. But we lived a pastoral existence, connected to, but moving across the surface of the earth. You know, maybe in kind of cycles from one place to another, you know, following seasons. But in that sort of atmosphere, and at that time, as Salgan points out in his book Stone Age Economics, actually a very good time to be a human. You know, 4-hour days, lazing around under trees really was most of what went on. And only with the coming of agriculture did things change. So we are not necessarily, as a species, prepared and environmentally hardwired to deal with land, landscape, and property and all that comes with it. We're playing catch-up over a very short period, it's only 10, 12,000 years. And that's led to some fairly significant and problematic outcomes. Not least, of course, the fact that when you stop moving around, you become much more subject to environmental risk. You know, if you imagine something, I mean, nobody really knows why we took to agriculture quite as rapidly as we did those millennia ago. But certainly what we gave up was the ability to move away from problems. You know, if you were in a place as a pastoral hunter-gatherer and that place changed, you moved away to find somewhere warmer, colder, with more woolly mammoths, with more kind of wild barley. And of course, you know, when we stop moving around and we start farming the land, then we invent lots of things out of necessity. Housing being one of them, you know, built shelters, and you start to put things in those built shelters, property, possessions, and over time, the perspective of being a human changes radically, from being kind of, you know, effectively living an animalistic lifestyle, albeit maybe with some interesting culture, lots of interesting interactions, language and communications, but living like an animal with all the benefits that brings, to doing something that no animal has really done before in terms of changing its habitat and environment to an extent which you know, I don't think the planet had seen before. And of course, working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, being subject to lots of horrible diseases from the animals that we keep, and generally being a lot more miserable, albeit a lot more of us, because of course, while agriculture is a pretty horrible job, as anyone who's ever done it will know, the upside is you get surplus calories, so you can have more kids. So an interesting trade-off was made, and one of the parts of this trade-off was trading off a relatively flat social structure, with mainly temporary chieftains around the time of war, and then peace leaders who were different, maybe matriarchs or patriarchs, trading that off for a hierarchical social structure. Because when we started settling down, and we started, inverted commas, owning land, then over time, certain individuals started owning more land than other individuals, and those individuals had more power. And rapidly we see the emergence of hierarchical structures. There's a really great book called Why the West Rules, brackets for now, by Ian Morris. And he points out that, you know, in about 4000 BC, in kind of Uruk, Sumerian times, you know, part of Mesopotamia, Fertile Crescent, we see the invention of things like irrigation ditches and priests and writing. You know, the first epic, the first piece of fiction, really, the epic Gilgamesh was Sumerian. Meetings, bureaucrats, you know, priests who actually wrote down how much grain was in the storehouse and whose grain it was and how much they were allowed on a daily basis. So when we settle down, we start to see the emergence of what we know now as human society, but which actually, in historical terms, only covers 5% or less of human history. And of course, as I said, with that comes environmental risk. There's another empire I reference here. Anyone know who that is? Russell Crowe. This is balanced in the Raquel Welch picture. It's supposed to be anyway. And, it's a great quote by Camelia 60 AD, who talks about the fact that the land under Roman sway is just not as fertile as it once was. And lots of reasons led to the Roman Empire's decline, but the collapse of the agricultural economy, the debasement of the currency following that, the inability to get as much out of the land as was needed, even with the application of more and more slaves, was at the heart of why Rome ended up where it was 200 or 300 years after this. The degradation of those landscapes, the inappropriate valuation of land, if you like. So we need to think about land, we need to think about why it's important. But of course we don't, and there's a reason we don't, and the reason that we don't think about land and why it's important in modern times is because of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution did a number of things for us. One of the most important things it did was uproot people from their localities and move them largely to cities. Again, a migration, economic migration in this case, at an unheard of scale. Firstly in England and then shifting to other parts of the UK and then the continent and the Americas, where people who were formerly rural, living off and being prosperous through a deep connection to the land, moved into cities because the wages were better in making manufactures. And of course what was left behind was the land that was then farmed, maybe owned by absentee landlords and farmed by tenant farmers, and that rurality continued. But we now live in a world where over half of the population just lives in cities globally. And again, that is an incredibly new development. It's something that is only, 300 years old. Most people do not live off the land. Most people do not get their calories from anywhere near where they live. And the novelty of this is something we shouldn't forget when we think about the problems we face in understanding land. The novelty of moving away from the land that feeds us, and living somewhere else and being cut off from that resource is something which I think we don't think about enough. But of course, what this movement into cities enabled us to do was forget how dependent we were on the land. When you farm, clearly you are aware of the vagaries of weather, the vagaries of season, and the vagaries of crop fruition or otherwise. When you live in a city and the food comes in on horses and carts, and then maybe in 18-wheeler trucks eventually, you can forget about the deep connection you have to that land in terms of your basic welfare. This is a picture of some cotton farmers, or obviously not farmers in the owning sense, but some people farming cotton in deep south of the US, whereby of course all our materials used to come from. We now farm our land on an industrial scale, so we don't need any people on the land, or virtually no people on the land anymore, because of the mechanized nature of agriculture. We can less than 2% of the population of the UK works in agriculture, and it's just not part of our DNA anymore, if you like. It's part of our DNA, not part of our social context. But of course, everything that we are in terms of our ability to be human in a modern context, in a modern sense, in its modern style, is still fundamentally dependent on land and what's underneath it. This is a scene from a 1930s film called How Green's My Valley. I would say you can see my house from there, but I think that it's just over the back. And the lights that we have on tonight, the chairs that we're sitting on, some of the clothes we're wearing, the food we put in our bodies, all comes from and under the land. But from a long, long way away. A lot of it from the Middle East. In terms of coal now, Poland, South America, Australia. our dependency on the fundamental ecosystem services, if you will, or mineral services, hasn't diminished at all. In fact, it's increased markedly. But we're allowed to forget it. And of course, at the heart of this is oil, the great wall of crisis that is coming towards us as we deplete our fossil fuels and become less and less able to lever oil out of the ground in a way which sits comfortably with our expectations. And the problem is that this ability to push away resource demands is disappearing rapidly. I think I said in a blog the other day, energy, unlike football, really is coming home. What we have been able to do up to now, because we have not needed the landscape to supply, the local landscape to supply our basic needs, we've been able to fetishize it. We've been able to treat it as a pretty resource that we can look at, enjoy, and then go home again. Whether it's the Brecon Beacons, whether it's the, that's actually Port Talbot Beach with my son on it. You can't see the steelworks, it's around the corner. But this is the vision that we have when we think of the word landscape. And yes, these are all industrialized landscapes, to some degree or other. I mean, there are probably even sheep on the steepest of those sides. But we forget they're industrialized, past industrialized. And we treat them as something which is a luxury. You know, it's nice to have the Welsh landscape. But of course, we don't use that landscape to support our welfare except in a kind of cultural sense, if I can use that ecosystem services term, in the sense of, you know, it's nice to have. We don't think that if it disappeared, we'd die tomorrow. And of course, what we've got is not just an odd view of landscape, but we've got an oddly, almost English 19th century view of landscape. You know, I mean, you would not be surprised to see Wordsworth wandering up here, you know, writing a poem to a sheep or something. We seem to have stuck in how we view our land in a peculiarly Victorian way, quite kind of patriarchal, paternalistic. We must look after this heritage, you know. Despite the fact we've been cutting trees down off it for the last 10,000 years or more, and it looked very different to this 11,000 years ago. And as I said earlier, as particularly energy scarcity bites, but as other issues come to book, energy is coming home, and resource use is coming home, and it's coming home to a place that isn't used to it. This is the top right. Sorry, pardon me. You see some of the flaring activity off the shale, the fracking in America. That's actually the Midwest, Texas, and the Gulf is equally impressive in terms of burning of the gas off the frack wells. I say that's just mostly in the Midwest. You can see Minneapolis, St. Paul is quite a big city. If anybody's ever been there, it's very cold most of the time. But you can see the amount of light emitting from the fracked wells in the back, and is of a similar level. And you know, there's a Snowdonia hydro development there. That's a Cuban city garden, and some triffids, tripods peering out of the murk there. We can no longer use technology to help us forget about the fact that we burn through energy and other resources at an horrific rate per person. If we want to continue to do that, we have to accept that we have to re-engineer, renegotiate our relationship with our surrounding landscape, because we no longer have the political power to pull resources in from other poorer parts of the world to make our lifestyles as comfortable as they are. We can no longer dominate, either through us or through our economic structures. We can no longer dominate the resource-rich parts of the world to ensure those resources come home to stop us having to use our own. And my kind of, you know, my thesis is that there's no silver bullet which will stop this happening. You know, cold fusion. I've never shouted at the TV more than I did when I saw Brian Cox suggesting that cold fusion was just around the corner. Not only because he's an academic professor who's on telly and I'm not, Not just that, anyway, I should say. But the idea that scientists have that if we can just give it one last push, we will find the perpetual motion machine and everything will be okay. It's not going to happen. That's why we're in a position where we're debating whether or not we should frack the UK landscape. If there was something easier to do, we'd be doing it, because fracking, and we're doing a project at the moment for Welsh Government, whether you like it or not, fracking is pretty dirty and pretty problematic from lots of perspectives. Now, we might end up having to do it, but it just shows you what options there are, or rather, what options there aren't, in terms of sustaining the lifestyle that we currently have. And for this audience, I guess, the point is that our current acceptance or understanding of land as a leisure resource or as a cultural artifact is obsolescent and rapidly becoming obsolete. You know, there are 10,000, probably 10,000 hill farmers in Wales that will go bankrupt tomorrow if the UK left the European Union. You know, if you single farm payments stop tomorrow, not many hill farms will be left in Wales. And yet, we're not having a conversation about whether hill farming is an appropriate thing to do with this valuable resource that we have. Keep sheep on it. It may well be, but we're not having that conversation. Because we look at land in a different way than we look at other economic resources. We are happy to look at a bunch of people and say, you know what, you live up there in those valleys and you're all ex-miners or now, you know, ex-workers in various factories or ex-call centre workers, and you ain't fit for purpose anymore, so you have to change. You can go away and reskill, or you can move somewhere else, or you can do something else, or you can just, you know, get off my dole list. We're happy to look at lots of economic resources and tell them they have to change or try and change them. You know, a road is not good enough, we build a new road. Or maybe we don't, but, you know. But we don't seem to do that with land, because you don't see it as an economic resource, even though it's the most fundamental of all economic resources. So, to conclude, whatever we do with land in Wales, surely it has to fit with our wider aspirations to be a moral and sustainable region. And, you know, no matter how bad it gets, you know, if you've got a new wind farm overlooking your house in Powys, I suspect you wouldn't change that lady walking up that oil pipe in the Niger Delta. Because that's where your oil is coming from, that enables you to drive to the local post office and put a bit of a poster in the window to complain about your wind farm. So that equalisation, need versus want, if you like, here versus there, has to be part of any conversation we have about what our land is for. As I've already said, I mean, that at some point we're going to have a conversation about agriculture, and it's one nobody wants to start, and I can understand why nobody wants to start it, but I can tell you now, if, you know, there is it's probably not, it's a minority chance, but we could be meeting in this building in 5 or 10 years' time outside the European Union, having switched off ERDF, ESF, single farm payment and cap. And if you want to live in a place which hasn't thought about and prepared for that, be my guest. But it may not happen, but if it does happen, Wales will be very rapidly transformed in a very, very problematic fashion. Because you can bet Westminster's not going to step in when Brussels steps out. Are we having a conversation about this? I don't see it. Maybe we are, and just going to the wrong meetings. Maybe we should go to place more often, Terry, and already talking about this. Tell me if you are. And, you know, what we could do, of course, is carry on getting coal out of the valleys. Let's dig the biggest hole in Europe, because that's what we do in the valleys. We do coal. It's just as bad. You know, it's just as short-sighted. And yet, you will find quite a lot of people in the valleys who still hark back to a past when Wales meant something, industrially and economically, and they see things like Phosphofran as an example of that. Quite a lot of what I'm doing my year out is about why places are poor, and quite a lot of my contention is that places are poor largely because the people in them don't own or have control over their local resources. And it may not be that control of local resources will automatically make places prosperous. That's far from going to happen. but it's necessary if not sufficient. If you have communities which are cut off from their fundamental living space outside of their own front door by, you know, whenever I look, I live in Pontypridd, and, you know, I dug up some land ownership stuff the other day. I think somebody's trying to build a house somewhere. I was like, oh, look, we own that land. And, you know, it's crochet, you know. And you think, what? All these years later, we still have this hangover in Wales, which they've started remediating in Scotland. The fact that because Wales is an industrial construct, modern Wales is an industrial construct, pardon me, we don't have ownership over vast swathes of our land. We don't have connection to that land. And unfortunately, and I have to be careful here given my audience, the Wales level structures that control that land on the, you know, the forestry, for example, on behalf of local populations, quite often don't do a good job of communicating to those populations why and how it's being managed and for whom. You know, I do quite a lot of work with community groups who are seeking to change their places for the better, and the inability of government structures at all spatial levels, Wales and local authority, to accept that this land is primarily affecting the people who live there, first and foremost, and behave in a way which follows through on that is extremely frustrating. And there's, you know, obviously I'm broad brushing. There are lots of examples of where we do see a coherent approach to land management between local and no national trust. You know, do a lot of good work, for example, trying to do lots of good work in kind of squaring this circle of non-ownership, but the impacts that happen on local people. You know, this is 50% the problem with the wind turbines, if not more. I mean, there's quite a lot of academic research coming out of, well, Scotland and Wales and other places that suggests that, you know, if it was our turbines, not their turbines, you know, and maybe if we were getting paid for the electric that was going down those pylons, then the response to wind turbine developments will be very different. That, you know, there's reasonable evidence that there's quite a strong factor, non-local ownership is quite a strong factor in the tension we have over energy developments. Oh, solutions, right. The Welsh Government are very keen on ecosystem services approach, which I theoretically wholeheartedly approve of. An ecosystem services approach seeks to manage landscapes to deliver sustained benefit from those landscapes. It's clearly the right thing to do. Look, I put my glasses on because I've got some words now. So I put my glasses on so I can see what the words are that I wrote and forgot I'd written. And I think ecosystem services has huge potential to manage places in a properly local sense and incorporate the welfare of the people who live in those places. That's what it says on the tin, and that's what it should and indeed could do. I have some issues with it. God, it's slow. I know that you know. Progress is undoubtedly being made, but please tell us on the website, Matt, please. If, you know, it seems that there's the critical mass of kind of, you know, interest in, development of, rolling out of ecosystem services pilots and then scaling of pilots and implementation. You know, we really need this done. To see if it's going to work or not. But if it's not going to work, we need to do something else fairly quickly. And I think this is clearly a resourcing. You know, this is, I think it's partly a resourcing question. It's partly a kind of departmental silo question. But I would like to see, if we are going to go down the path of ecosystem services, some more rapid progress and clearly, you know, officers would not like to see the same thing. And if any politicians in the room, give them more bloody money people to do it with quickly. I do worry about ecosystem services a little because it's so place-based, because, and this may have changed with the latest DEFRA work which I haven't seen, but the temptation with ecosystem services approaches is to forget that a shed load of our calories, that's a technical term by the way, shed load, of our calories comes from outside Wales. Okay, so a lot of our welfare depends on imported food, imported fossil fuels, imported materials, clothes and so on. And an ecosystem services approach, by its very nature, ignores all that, or at least potentially does if you don't think about the flip side, which is okay, we can manage our local landscape to deliver maximum benefit, but how does that fit? You know, you can't substitute away from using your own landscape by using other people's in a problematic power relationship. There's no point saying, well, you know, ecosystem services says we shouldn't really have a wind farm here, we shouldn't really have a hydro, can't have that hydro there because we want to keep the fish there. So instead of having a hydro plant on that river, because ecosystem services says not, we'll just import a bit more oil from Saudi Arabia, that'll be fine, won't it? So we need to think about that moral responsibility, the climate change responsibilities we have in implementing ecosystem services in a way which is properly holistic. I think we can do it. I think that the ability is there, but it's very, very complicated. I've put that third point in there. Right, I'm only a poor economist and don't understand biodiversity versus ecosystem services. My understanding is that you can manage a place for biodiversity and you can manage a place for ecosystem services maximisation or optimisation. Doing both ain't necessarily easy. You can tell me if that's right or wrong later. But my understanding is there may be some conflicts or tensions between our biodiversity responsibilities and targets and our desire to maximise or optimise ecosystem services in the landscape. And more problematically, come back to the first point. You know, I've read quite a lot of documentation in the last couple of months coming out of the Welsh Government for my sins. And I just don't see ecosystem services in any of this. I don't really see it in the new Planning Act. I don't really see it underpinning the Future Generations Bill. I don't really see it in the Williams, certainly not in the Williams report. You know, so where is it? How is it going to flow into all these really important documents and policies if it's the way in which we value our landscape and actually manage our place? Where is it in these documents? Because I can't seem to see it there, at least not in the way that I would like it to, would like to be there. So to conclude then, I mean, I think, you know, well, I'm not going to use solutions because then I'd have to charge you and it'd get really embarrassing and there'd be a bucket at the door because I'm an economist. But in terms of some approaches, broad brush approaches we might want to think about. My first problem, this is always my first problem with the Welsh Government, is where's the vision, sunshine? You know, what do you want this place to look like in 20 years, in 50 years? And you've got quite a lot of highfalutin kind of, you know, broad brush, we'd like it to look happy and prosperous and healthy and equal and blah, 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 and motherhood and apple pie. And I don't see any discussion of, certainly in the Future Generations Bill, where the one thing might actually take precedence over another and two things might be mutually exclusive. So if we have an approach to managing the landscape that says, you know what, we want to maximise ecosystem services in this landscape, brackets, that ain't sheep farming because nobody buys land really anymore from Wales, close brackets. You know, that's fine, but we need to have that conversation underpinning the policies that we put in place. Because if we say we're going to do ecosystem services unless we, you know, hack off the NFU, then there's no point doing it at all, is there? And then, of course, value those ecosystem services through the great work that people like Steve Spoden and others do in the Welsh Government to try to understand how you actually measure this stuff and start to make real decisions based on those principles. We get really sentimental about Wales. It's one of our greatest weaknesses, I think. You know, don't forget Wales is really only 200 years old. In the sense of an industrialised region, leaving aside, you know, pre-industrial world, which is a very different beast. And we have to be prepared to start with a blank sheet of paper and not actually give in to the idea that the status quo, you know, I remember meeting Ron Davis years and years and years ago before he and I made various mistakes, not together, I hasten to add. And, you know, we came up to the university and we gave him a big kind of spiel about the Welsh. He was going to be our first minister. That's how long ago it was. You know, he was going to be our first minister. First minister. And, you know, and we gave him this big spiel of the Welsh economy and the sectors and this and that. And he said, what you're telling me is we're managing decline. And I say, yes, Ron. You know, that's what we're doing at the moment, unless we can start with a sufficiently radical approach to redraw the way in which we manage our landscape and by extension manage our society. I think, you know, I don't see why we manage forestry at a Wales level, or a hillside, I should say, at a Wales level. You know, because if you walk through, as I do, I mean, I quite regularly walk and cycle around the valleys of South Wales, and there are some really good bits. But anybody who walks through a conifer forest on that dry, brown earth, and maybe if you're lucky, hears one or two birds, you know, you can't think this is 100 years of... See, I've been bigging him up and he's late. It's typical, isn't it? I mean, it's now great a job Steve is doing, he comes in late. I won't do that again. Anybody who's walked around a conifer forest, can't say that this is a really good job of managing the landscape, given that, frankly, the trees are crap as well. They grow too fast, they're not good for much. So we've got to try and invent new ways of building houses to use them. That's how bad the trees are generally. So maybe it's about time somebody else had a go. And maybe people who actually live in those places should de facto and by right be managing those places, unless there's a very good reason for them not to, not the other way around. You know, this comes back to a wider argument about subsidiarity and devolution and where Cardiff sits in that hierarchy. But at the moment what we have is the Welsh Government, which effectively owns this landscape and allows communities to do things on it if they're lucky. Well, I think it's about time we flip it the other way around. I say, not something that's going to solve a share of problems, but at least people would have to own their own mistakes in a way they don't at the moment at a local level. And the other thing, the other elephant in the room is private ownership of land. I mean, if you think about it, private ownership of land is a nonsense. Could you stand up a minute, Dave, if you don't mind? Are you telling me that that 80-kilogram bag of water, which might last, if it's lucky, 70 years, probably less than what he drinks, that can own a mountain that's 4 billion years old? Sit down, Dave, thank you very much. What an absolute nonsensical place to start a debate about what we do with landscape and how we maximise its usefulness to us. The individuals and the corporations that they give their writ to own the land. If we don't start to have a conversation about how we restrict and guide the ability of private landowners to manage that land in a way which actually does bring lasting benefit to the people who live around it, then I suspect there's no point starting having any sort of conversation at all. Okay, last slide. The way we approach land is born of a time we didn't need it because we were using other people's indirectly. That time is coming to an end. If we are going to be more dependent on our local landscapes for our fundamental welfare, more relocalization of food, materials, energy, we need to rethink the way in which we manage that landscape and our fundamental relationship with it. We sit at a point of huge opportunity at the moment. We have the Future Generations Bill, the new Planning Act, the Williams report and whatever Leighton's doing with that, and various other Welsh Government policies which are in a state of malleability. They can be subject to change at the moment in a way which in 3 or 4 years will not be true. That's an opportunity and a threat. You know, it's probably once in a generation time to get this kind of stuff right. You know, the new European kind of funding as well, the RDP and so on is in a similar sort of boat. But if we miss this opportunity, we just fudge it for another couple of years, then we're going to set this stuff in stone, it'll be too late. It'll all be siloed, it'll all be going in different directions, and we'll just be exactly the same place in 10 years' time, and probably 20 years' time. And my worry is, as far as I can see, nobody outside of this evening is actually having a discussion about fundamentally rewriting this relationship between the people and the land of Wales, what we do with it, what it's for. And if that's not going to happen, then no good will come of it. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Calvin. Thank you so much. That was a really great start to this evening's debate. I think some really provoking comments there. So without further ado, can I introduce you to Mary O'Connor, who's from WYG and is going to talk to us about green and blue infrastructure. Mary.
Good evening. Noswaith dda. It's a bit difficult to know where to pick up after that last challenge that Calvin threw out to us there. Let me just find my buttons. Am I getting feedback? So I'm starting not with the land, you might say, but with the water. And in fact, my starting point is the challenge posed to our existence at all, I suppose you might say, and certainly to our land, by climate change. It's presenting us with unreliable weather and more extreme events, the 1 in 10 year instead of the 1 in 100 year storm and flood. And the ways in which we can put our environmental assets, our valuable environmental assets, to work to help us adapt and be resilient to the effects of climate change. But the foundation point, the starting point, has got to be the value we place on the landscape and on our environment, whether we own it or not. And that comprises its green and blue assets, the land assets, the water components, and the infrastructure they give us, they provide in the places where we live and work and enjoy life. Remember earlier this year, as we face into this year's winter, scenes from not even a full year ago come to mind. Just across the channel in Somerset, which you might say is a kind of international lesson. You remember the incessant rain and the flood warnings and the graphic images, the worst flooding in 20 years, but not an isolated event. It's happening more frequently and in more places. And it comes with a massive price tag. The government estimates £2 billion annually, £2 billion annually it's costing us. And £3 billion worth of insurance claims were made in 2012, so that's even before last year's flooding, and a calculation of 2.7 million properties at risk, let alone the more immediate costs of bringing exotic plant and pumps, especially from the Netherlands, to deal with the immediate crisis. You'll remember also the MP for Bridgewater expressing the anguish of the people of Somerset last year. In the process, setting up this dichotomy between spending good money on birds versus the needs of people. But, you know, as Calvin has referred to, think about what has happened in our own lifetimes to biodiversity. It's a tale of decline, a tale of losing habitat resources, and characterized by some commentators as a mass extinction, like the dinosaurs, going on before our very eyes. So we've got to think to ourselves, is this dichotomy between nature and people really realistic? But what's the solution? Last year, there was, or earlier this year it is, isn't it? It feels like it was last year. There was a scramble, even in the midst of an economic crisis, to find a pot of money to do something, anything. So instant solutions were reached for, instant action that would produce the biggest impact in the media and address the most vociferous demands of the public. Dredge the rivers was the cry, but can the solution really be a dead parrot story, to coin a phrase? But that isn't really the question. It's not a question of failure to dredge versus failure to value the environmental assets around us and think what harnessing those assets could have done in these extreme situations. This thinking, just an excerpt here, you can read it at your leisure. This thinking inspired an open letter to the Prime Minister from the Landscape Institute in concert with a number of sister professions, also last February, urging decision makers to be creative and to plan at a strategic level, to respond strategically to the crisis rather than with immediate short-term solutions, to plan for both the natural environment and the built environment, to see them as integral, and to plan on the larger canvas of whole catchment management, to think about how forestry, sorry Calvin, forestry, land management, soft engineered flood alleviation schemes to hold back water in the upper reaches of rivers in concert with specific focused dredging or other interventions lower down the catchment. We also need to carry out measures in existing developments, and that's something that's beginning to take place with the Dúr Cymru's Rainscape programme, to make them flood resilient, while ensuring also that when new developments are being planned and designed, that they should be flood resistant from the moment they start. So talking about investing in our assets and the returns you might get, this Sturt Peninsula, the Sturt Marshes, is the project that was so bitterly complained of last February during last year's floods, if you may recall that. It is in fact a joint venture between the Environment Agency and the local Wildlife and Wildfowl and Wetland Trust to convert an area of conventionally managed agricultural land into a new salt marsh and freshwater habitat. It was opened in September of this year to acclaim, if you look at the website which has been set up for it and the comments from visitors to it. And in September, the sea was let back into the land, as of course you know, Somerset levels, like our Gwent levels, are coastal edge pieces of land. But already it's a multifunctional landscape yielding multiple benefits to people and wildlife. So what the people of Somerset are getting for this investment is not only a land that will continue to be farmed, but in a different way, in association with local graziers, and in a way that will yield lots of benefits, not just for people, but for wildlife, providing habitat for the birds and wildfowl and other wildlife, providing flood protection for the village of Sturt, providing enhanced public access for further benefit to the local people, and also offsetting the habitat losses in the Severn Estuary arising from sea level rises due to climate change. It's also, and as a landscape architect, this is what interests me about landscape, it can do all those things, provide for wildlife and for people's enjoyment, but it's a sustainable and diverse landscape where the character of the area and its aesthetic qualities also benefit. So really, investment of £30-some million in birds should be seen in the context of the billions that is in fact the price of flooding. Investing in this kind of development planning, what kind of places does it produce? Here are some examples. There's a wonderful publication by Syria, of which the Landscape Institute partnered, which explains how you can get these diverse, functional, useful and economic developments in landscape settings that work to manage the water of the area. You can have upland, moorland managed with a combination of wetland habitats at the top of the river catchment, which holds back water and prevents it from rushing down to the lowland. At the top right is a 1900-unit housing development where the water management functions have produced this tremendous green amenity open space for people. And you might recognise the bottom picture here on my side, which is the plan for a Foslas racecourse, which brings together the racecourse, the housing development, renewable energy developments, and a diversity of functions on that land set within a landscape structure which aims to manage the water for the area and for the communities. One way of looking at our environmental resources in this context is, as Calvin points out, to imagine what life and what the environment would be like without them. How would we get on without these functions provided by nature to our well-being? Going truly international now, with a lesson from much further afield. A green sponge for a water-resilient city. This is a very interesting project, and to me it's probably trebly interesting because it's the subject of an award from the American Society of Landscape Architects, and you kind of know it's important if it's getting a prize from them. But this project is not in America, it's in China. And all our mental images of China are about pollution hazes and unbreathable air, but it's not preventing them from doing some interesting work based around the worry about not just about air quality, but that modern cities are not resilient when faced with the inundations of stormwater. And also it's won an award because of the key role that's recognised for landscape architecture in addressing this problem in planning and fostering truly sustainable urban development. Excuse me, my pages are sticking together. It's all based around what they call a stormwater park, which acts as a green sponge, as in the title of the award, but it also manages the water, cleanses it, filters it, restores it to its aquifer, provides storage so it doesn't run off and cause problems elsewhere, and also provides for recreational activities and the aesthetic experience, which is just as important in our built environment, while at the same time providing this fantastic, beautiful place, an environmental amenity in the heart of a highly built up area. It accommodates all kinds of social and leisure activities, even if it's just sitting and enjoying the view on the grass terraces. But imagine living in some of this high-rise, dense accommodation and having this to look out on. Most of us would give our eye teeth for that. And that is providing multiple benefits and functions to the community. So coming nearer home, Natural England has joined in the ecosystem services game, I suppose you could say, by pursuing this idea of applying the language of price and value to ecosystem assets and services. I quibble with that whole idea of putting prices on the ecosystem and its components and its services. But what we're finding is that in order to sell the story, we have to deploy people like Calvin and his colleagues to convince people that they should spend money here rather than there. And the purpose of this document is to provide us with a succinct evidence base in a way that people can harness when they're building cases for investing in the natural environment as part of a wider strategic planning effort in a way that will yield benefits into the future. People who get involved with this kind of planning have their eye on the long-term future because you act today for the dividends we can reap in the years to come. So, and it's not as if this is a new idea. We are blessed with quite a lot of guidance and exemplar projects already, and I give you here just some examples of documents that the Landscape Institute has produced and been trying to promote this integrated thinking, not just focusing on ecosystem services per se, but on the integration of the built and the unbuilt environment. You'll note, you probably recognise the illustration, in fact, on the far left document there, which is from the Gwent Levels Newport Wetlands project. Because this way, as I say, of approaching development is, I would say, meat and drink to landscape architects. But now we would see that for wider society, there are compelling reasons to invest in landscape, to value our landscape, and to help address the issues of climate change. So coming closer to home, we mentioned Natural Resources Wales already, and their thinking as expressed in their corporate business plan is, I think, quite a lot of food for encouragement. It goes a bit away from the focus on purely ecosystem services thinking, but it embeds that thinking into what looks like wider vision, and they're structuring their planning around the idea of 5 goods, not goods as in tradable commodities, but as in things like a good environment. And Calvin setting out what looks quite like a vision. What will a good environment look like? The other areas then are based around people, business, organisation, that's their organisation, and knowledge, which can be disseminated and promote this way of planning. NRW set out these key ideas, the fundamentals for a good environment. And these are ideas that are gaining expression in initiatives that are getting going now. I mentioned the Dúr Cymru Rainscape one, but we'll begin to see the emergence of green infrastructure strategies from local councils. Monmouthshire, Colette is here somewhere, I'm sure she'll be able to tell you a lot more about it, and Bridgend, so we can look forward to a more integrationist and strategic approach to planning for development and nature together. So one of the problems we have to address is that we can know the price of everything and the value of nothing. We need to engage with people, with communities at the local level, as well as to thinking strategically. We need to persuade planners and communities that there isn't always a dichotomy between jobs and nature, between dredging and birds, that there are in fact manifold rewards to ourselves and to the environment from valuing our environmental assets, from investing in strategic and holistic planning and management of our green and blue infrastructure. Especially important when remembering that we have this rolling programme of the Wales Infrastructure Investment Plan, which is very much focused on the grey. So I'm leaving you with this question to stimulate the discussion later on. What price not valuing our landscape, not valuing our blue and green infrastructure? Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce to you David Llewellyn, who's going to look at valuing our landscape through a social lens. David.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to speak this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd also like to thank Calvin for describing me as an 80-kilogram bag of water. Most people would say I'm a lot heavier and full of air, so we'll find out. Okay, for the next 15 minutes or so, what I'd like to do is to talk about how we can better connect our communities and some of our most deprived communities in Wales with their natural capital and their natural resources, such that they are the beneficiaries of ecosystem services, if you wish to say that, and that they become the custodians and advocates for their natural environment, or even owners, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so Eleanor Roosevelt said you should do one thing every day that scares you. So this is my one thing for today, and it's to show a slide about capital in front of Calvin as an economist. But I think it's probably fair to say that most people now, economists or what have you, would say that natural capital underpins and is necessary for every other type of capital, be it human, social, financial, or manufactured. And of course, this term natural capital was first coined by E.F. Schumacher back in 1973 in his book Small is Beautiful. But interestingly, Eleanor Roosevelt's other half, who you may have heard of, FDR himself, 32nd President of the United States, understood that even during times of austerity, it's absolutely vital that we invest in our natural resources, what he termed our permanent capital. So, I've been digging about a little bit in the Welsh Government draft budget, interesting times. over the last few weeks, and this is it, released in September, which shows we're going to spend around 15.3 billion in the next financial year. If you look at some of the figures within it, you'll find that in terms of actually investment in our natural resources, it's around about 2.63% of the whole budget. That's £404 million. Now, there are other budgetary lines which have environmental elements that will benefit our environment, but nevertheless, 2.63%, as I say, is the percentage of the Welsh Government budget towards natural resources in the next year, of which a fifth, 0.5% of the total is what's being earmarked for landscape and outdoor recreation. Now, all of these budget lines, with the exception, I suppose, of local government, are absolutely dwarfed by the health and social care budget. £6.6 billion, nearly 45% of the budget is going to be spent on health and social care. And you can understand why, with the issues that we've got. But it's unsustainable in the long run. With the ageing demographic, with the issues we see around physical and mental ill health, and the costs associated with new medical technologies and therapies, that is not sustainable. So what we need to be doing is better working with our natural resources to try and address positively some of these other budgetary lines: health, economy, tackling poverty in some of our poorest communities. Talking of our poorest communities, and Calvin's obviously mentioned the valleys quite a few times this evening, and like him, I'm from the valleys originally. And this is a very simple slide to explain. If it's dark blue, it's not good. On the left-hand side, then that is the incidence of chronic ill health, physical ill health in the valleys around about 2010. And on the right-hand side, you will see that that is the incidence of mental ill health in Wales, and the valleys come out worse than anywhere else. And just to put that into context, what does that mean economically? In the Cwm Taf Local Health Board area in 2010 alone, £2.25 million spent on prescriptions for antidepressants. That is not sustainable. It is not an equitable society. And these issues, financial issues you see, have a human cost, of course. It means that people who are suffering with these diseases, mental ill health issues, as I say, are unfortunately unable to work. And we've got huge high levels of economic inactivity in the valleys, some of which is largely attributable, as I say, to ill health. And we've got a number of other issues. So here's the question. How can we work with our natural environment to try and address some of these issues to get a sustainable future for these communities and also a sustainable future for the environment? Now, we've got a great tradition of working with the natural environment in the valleys and connecting communities, including my great-grandfather who's in this. And it largely involved putting people in large metal containers and cages, dropping them into the bowels of the earth, digging up the coal, and then depositing the waste on the hillsides. I suggest not sustainable. And in fact, we found it's not sustainable. Only over 100, 150 years did we get some sort of modicum of prosperity within the valleys, but we found since the demise of extractive and heavy industries that what's happened is that we've got huge socio-economic problems as a legacy. Now, notice I didn't say environmental problems as a legacy, but we did do, and this was where I was born and brought up. And if I'd said 40 years ago that we could use the environment in the valleys as a driver towards a sustainable future, I would probably have been sectioned, because this is what it looked like, and I could have shown you a black and white photo actually of it, but there we go. And this is just another view of it, an absolutely derelict, despoiled environment. We loved it. It's part of that folklore almost about the valley, but here we go. That's what it looks like today. Reclamation schemes at the start of the 1970s, particularly in this area and in other parts of the valleys, coupled with the power of nature and now people's involvement, have totally transformed this area. Now, when I started working for Communities First in this area back in 2006, and the environment is no longer a focus of the Communities First programme, and I think that's quite interesting, this is what local people said that they wanted to use as an amenity and to see an improvement in, and they've done it. It's now a local nature reserve run by local people in combination with the local authority there. So really the question is, and this is Blaengad, of course, and Pen Peak, right across the valleys and other parts of Wales, how do we connect what I would call Mr. and Mrs. Jones in Blaengad with their natural resources such that they mutually benefit each other. Okay, the next slide shows a huge problem, and pardon the pun, but I'm going to concentrate on health. And some of you would have seen last week the McKinsey Global Institute report, which says that obesity is now one of the biggest problems in the world. Unfortunately, we are now spending about £1.3 trillion per annum in addressing obesity. That means, in terms of the UK economy, about £47 billion. And if you extrapolate to a Welsh context, it's probably around about £2.5 billion every year. So, whilst diet, of course, and other factors are obviously implicated in obesity, undoubtedly sedentary lifestyles and people being physically inactive contribute hugely. Now, some of the issues that you will have seen from physical inactivity include major diseases, such as various types of cancer, type 2 diabetes. This is a slide from William Bird, a GP in England who worked with Natural England a few years ago and now runs Intelligent Health. And as I said, you can see the risk factor and reduction associated with physical inactivity and these types of diseases. And of course, this was re-emphasized and reinforced by the release of the Caerphilly cohort study, which came out at the end of last year, which showed that healthy lifestyles, looking at a 30-year span of a population in Caerphilly in the valleys, healthy lifestyles reduce the incidence of chronic diseases and dementia. And one of the biggest factors for dementia was inactivity, physical inactivity. Okay, let's just have a look at diabetes then specifically, and you'll see where I'll come from in a moment in terms of getting people engaged with their natural environment. The cost of diabetes and its complications every year to the UK is around about £14 billion. That's £25,000 every minute. Something to think about. Now, if you're unfortunate enough to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which accounts for most of that expenditure, this is almost certainly the first-line drug that you'll be given, a very simple drug called metformin. It's cheap to produce and cheap to prescribe. But the cost of metformin prescriptions in 2006 was around about £37 million. It is now £81 million and rising. Again, unsustainable. So what if we didn't have to use metformin to address some of these issues regarding type 2 diabetes, for example? So we did a study sponsored by the Valleys Regional Park through Groundwork Wales, where we worked with Cardiff Metropolitan University to do some research as to the underlying mechanisms behind what it is that addresses people's ill health through getting them more active in their local environment. So this was just a community walk-in program, a number of groups across the valleys in an 8-week period. And what we found was their mental well-being improved in keeping with what we've seen previously. Their cardiovascular disease risk was reduced dramatically, and we started seeing the expression of gene pathways which led to the reduction of what we might call bad cholesterol. So, they are the pathways involved, and I don't expect you to take any of those details in, and that's the field. We found that, in fact, these pathways, switched on by metformin, but with all the problematical side effects that you get as a result, can actually be switched on beneficially by simply getting people to exercise and doing it in their natural environment. So instead of these pathways and this field, why are we not using these fields and these pathways without all the side effects? It can be done. Okay, so we know there's lots of programs that are out there, and I really picked up on your point, Calvin, that we see lots of pilots and more pilots, and then the pilots rolled out, and there's more and more pilots and pilots and pilots. And we've seen it with Mentro Allan previously, and we've seen it now with Come Outside. But they're all very good, and I have no criticism against them. But what I think we really need to do is to get local communities to take control of their environmental localities, and they can really make a difference. Now, this is one of the projects that we implemented through Valleys Regional Park called the Eberfach Trail, which you might be surprised is in the Eberfach Valley. And I think there as well. This connected 13 locally run or locally administered, I suppose, environmental spaces, including the local nature reserve I showed you earlier on, along a 10-kilometre trail. Now, What has happened as a result of the investment in that is that local people are now using and respecting their local environment. We've put counters at various points along this trail, and the figures are absolutely massive in terms of people using their natural environment. And it's because it's the communities themselves that are the custodians and advocates for use of that environment. What we will see is the concomitant health benefits as a result in a few years' time. But we're also seeing benefits through sustainable tourism, for example, and a number of social enterprises have also been developed as a result of this investment. Now, just consider it. That cost £1 million. Compare £1 million to £2.25 million on antidepressants in the Cwmtaf Local Health Board Authority in just 2010 alone. So you're seeing this right across the valleys. There are opportunities for communities to actually look and work with their environment. And this is another one. This came out of the Active Woods programme originally, was to try and get people more active in their natural environment again for health purposes. This is Cwmsai Brent, just above Treherbert. And again, it's starting to work. It's now part of a Welcome to Our Woods programme, and it's getting local communities and people out there active in their natural environment such that they value it and become beneficiaries of the ecosystem services provided. They would like to make themselves sustainable as a result of their activities, and one of the things they'd like to do is to actually create a micro-hydro scheme in these woods, along with a couple of other types of renewable energy programs as well. Now, that is not a pipe dream. It can happen. For example, just down the road, this is Clydach Vale 40 years ago. This is Clydach Vale just after its environmental remediation, and you might recognise the back of that person. Lots of people like to have seen the back of that person. And that's it nowadays. Again, a community owned and run, not owned as such, but a community-run countryside park, Cwm Clydach, which depends on its sustainability to a certain extent, or a large extent, through a micro-hydro scheme at the top end of the lake there, which provides around about 20 to 25k per annum in terms of a sustainable revenue. Now, here's the bottom line. In terms of trying to create another micro-hydro scheme in this community, they can't. They're coming up against all sorts of problems, and this is happening right across the valleys. I'm going to tell it as it is, because this is what I'm getting told as part of the job I'm doing at the moment with the University of South Wales, is that this is something we did through Valleys Regional Park, and the possible opportunities for micro-hydro schemes run by communities across the South Wales valleys. And it is just not happening. And if you speak to the people that would like to implement these schemes, they are saying that one of the biggest problems are abstraction licenses. They understand the concept of ecosystem services. They know that they need to look after the local wildlife, but they would also like to generate energy to make their schemes and their activities sustainable. So, for example, in Rhondda Cynon only one out of 25 micro-hydro schemes which could really take place has taken place, and that is in Clydach Vale, as we saw a little earlier. I'm going to skip that slide because we may want to come back to it during the discussion. I'm conscious of time. But we can work with our environment sustainably. It is not a question of urban versus rural, economy versus the environment, city and town versus country. It is certainly not. And we need to look forward to a sustainable future by working with our natural resources to make livable places for our communities wherever they are in Wales and not just in the valleys. Now, this is Park Slip Nature Reserve, which is run by the Wildlife Trusts of Wales, South and West Wales, and you might recognise a couple of people connecting with nature there. And 4 jobs created as a result of the investment simply at this site alone. Not huge numbers, but I was going to show you on the previous slide, and I will go back to it, that if we'd invested, and this was a study carried out with the Heads of the Valleys programme back in 2009, if we'd invested in looking after our ecosystem services more sustainably, at that time, potentially, we could have created anything between 300 and 500 jobs with around about a £70 million turnover per annum in terms of the wages that would have been produced as a result of it. So I'm going to finish the last couple of slides. I am conscious of time. Mary touched upon this in terms of places to live. In the 1960s, we decided that we were going to get rid of unfit housing, understandably so within the valleys, and build these new cities on the hills, such as Penrhys here in the Rhondda, and Coica here in Landaglo in the Ebbw Vach Valley. And unfortunately, despite the localities of a lot of these sites, I would argue that they were largely dislocated from their ecosystem services and their natural environment, if you wish to put it like that. And in Sweden, we've seen, for example, in the Malmö district of Gustafsberg, that they turned around the fortunes of one of the worst sink estates in the city by simply adopting an ecosystems approach to making sure through suds, rain gardens, local food production, to create an estate that is now livable and desirable. 20% of their tenancies now have dropped in terms of turnover. So we can do it. So here's the last couple of challenges for you as an audience and for us to perhaps discuss overall. Does anybody recognize this city? And if you've got good eyes, you probably see where it is. It's Birmingham. Now, what has Birmingham been proclaimed as in the last year? Britain's first biophilic city. Now, my sister-in-law comes from Birmingham, so I've got to be careful what I say, but it doesn't look particularly biophilic to me at this moment in time, but they've no doubt got plans, and they have got plans to work with their ecosystem services, their natural environment and nature within Birmingham to create a sustainable future. They don't see it as urban versus rural, economy versus the environment. And perhaps a better example of this is Portland, Oregon, one of the first biophilic cities, which is actually using their natural environment to create a sustainable future. So hopefully there's a little bit of food for thought. I've obviously a lot of food, according to Calvin. And I'd just like to thank you for listening to me, but I'd like to leave you with one last thought, and it's this quote. Raymond Williams, of course, wrote the City and the Country, and he actually looked through literature to see how we viewed the urban environment and the rural environment over the years, and actually understood that there was largely a myth of this dichotomy between urban and rural. And as he said, if we're going to be truly radical, what we really need to do is to make hope possible, instead of saying that despair is convincing all the time and decrying ourselves. We can create a new future, but we need to do it sustainably, working with our environment and working with our communities. Thanks very much.
Diolch yn fawr, David. Without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our Deputy Minister, Julie James, Deputy Minister for Skills and Enterprise. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. I'm really sorry I wasn't here at the beginning, but I was finishing off a debate in the Senedd about the contribution of older people to our society. And one of the things I said there was about cultural memory and how important it was to reconnect cultural memory back to the landscape. And I didn't even know what I was going to be hearing when I got over here this evening. It's great to be part of this. I came in halfway through Calvin's contribution, so I got some of the more radical parts of it. I'm sure he'll enlighten me as to the first bit, and some really thought-provoking contributions from the other two panellists. So without further ado, I'm going to invite them to join me on the stage, and we're going to have a question and answer session for you to put their radical opinions to the test.
Hi, James Bird from the Wildlife Trust Wales. Given all the, leading on to your point, Calvin, given all the bills that are going on at the minute, the Environment Bill, Social Bill, etc., and we're currently consulting on a nature recovery plan, and then linking into what you said as well, David, the sums of money that are going into a nature recovery plan is minuscule compared to a lot of the other budgets, so going in city regions, etc., are completely dwarfed. So how can we take this radical future forward with very small budgets and diminishing budgets as well?
We probably can't, but this requires, I think at some point we have to accept that our prosperity won't be guaranteed by getting closer to markets and more open to markets. And once we accept our prosperity might be guaranteed by husbanding our resources a bit better and making better use of them, then you might see that shift. But and some departments already make that shift in the Welsh Government, others haven't. And unfortunately, moving the speed the slowest.
So yeah, I think you're right, James, in many respects. Those budgets are minuscule, and it's about working far smarter with them. I take Calvin's point, entirely, that, we're not going to get back to the sort of levels of prosperity that we envisage we've had in the past, though arguably the valleys communities, which I've touched upon there, have never really experienced lots of prosperity. The owners have, but the people actually living and working there probably haven't. But yeah, I think it's just a question of how we can work much smarter. I don't think we're going to see huge increases in the sort of budgets for a nature recovery plan or something, so we've got to think very differently how we work with our natural resources, I would suggest.
Yes, where I see the opportunity in harnessing and piggybacking the big developments, the big, grey infrastructure, to use that glib phrase, but the built development projects that are going on, which are aimed at boosting the economy and so on. I mean, you only need a very small sliver on top of that budget to really capitalise on the green and blue context, the landscape context that has been put in, and to harness what they can offer to benefit nature or to benefit some other aspect of the development, which is not purely focused on the built, the concrete, the delivery of a particular piece of infrastructure. And that's where I would like to see the thinking shift, so that we don't say that there's the dichotomy, as I was saying. It's not just, we get our new road, but I'm sorry, we can't afford your nature reserve. What we've got to do is plan the road so that it's also delivering the nature reserve, in the water attenuation, the storm attenuation ponds, the acoustic barriers, all of these things which have necessary, everybody can agree these things are necessary, but we can then use them to deliver objectives for wildlife as well as for our enjoyment.
Actually, I forgot to say this at the end, and I didn't say the reason we showed Birmingham and Portland. If we are going to create city regions in South Wales, which we are, why shouldn't those city regions, the Cardiff Capital Region, the Swansea Bay City Region, be biophilic city regions, where we do work with our natural resources far more imaginatively and effectively for the benefit of everyone?
I can make a comment on that. Do I need the mic? Right, yeah, just coming back on some of the comments that we made, and the mention was made of the Valleys Regional Park. And luckily I've got an opportunity to present the green infrastructure opportunity of the valleys to the Cardiff Capital Region Group in February. So in advance of that, I'm currently going to see all the local authority directors of regeneration and environment in order to brief them, because I believe this is a great opportunity for the area. And if we can get that sort of political support, buy-in and mandate at that kind of level, then I think maybe we will see a change in the way that the various operatives in the region, through working together, perhaps we'll see the natural resource, because I do believe it is an economic and social regeneration driver. It's just that we've yet to realise the full extent of that.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think I would personally class myself as one of the politicians that's well up the chain on this, as many of you know me in the audience will know. I think the main challenge for us, actually, we're probably preaching to the converted here in this audience, that it's always the problem. The problem is, how do you get this message out to the planners and the regeneration specialists and so on in the localities, in the local government areas and so on. And the thing to remember there is that those people also live in the communities that they serve. And so actually what you really need is a hearts and minds change. So my own view, going with a hope over despair argument, is that if you remember how far we've travelled in actually what's quite a short period of time since the Welsh Government's been in place, I know that it seems horrendously slow to those outside of government, but as governments go, it's quite fast, actually. So what I would say is there's been a hearts and minds change, but if each and every one of you goes out and convinces 4 people over Christmas that this is the way to go and not the cheapest possible house with the least possible installation because it's cheaper, then actually we'll be moving that movement on right across Wales pretty quickly. Who's next? There you go.
association. But I'd really like to ask my question, wearing another hat as chair of a housing association in one of the most deprived areas of Wales. And I'd like to address this to Calvin, because I felt there were some contradictions in some of the things you were saying, so I'd just like to understand your thinking. You actually mentioned, you posed the question, why are places poor? And your answer was because they don't own or have control of their own resources. And then you went on to say towards the end about the issue of private landowners and about how we need to engage with those in terms of wealth creation, etc. And then picking up on what David said about the difficulties in the valleys, and I'm a valley girl as well, so I understand the issues as well as you two, about actually the wealth in the valleys is with the landowners. So really my question is to you is, what makes you think that giving people ownership and control of their own resources is going to get them out of poverty?
I didn't say that. I said it was necessary but not sufficient. I think I'm going to quote Karl Marx a little bit here. But I mean, Marx talked about the enemy of the industrial factory worker who didn't own his machine, so he didn't care. If you look at the difference between Wales and Scotland, people in Scotland know there's a possibility of owning their own landscape at a community level, not an individual level, so they care, and they do it to some extent, because the repatriation of land, in the Scottish government has been relatively successful. Because there's no prospect of having that connection in Wales, I think that translates to a wider enemy, a wider dislocation from social processes when you are not part of the economic picture that is painted at a UK level. So if you live in the valleys, you might own your own house if you're lucky, you might not. But if you don't have an outlet through a job which is worthwhile and which you are told is worthwhile, and you also don't have an outlet in terms of having anything to work with, you might have an allotment, obviously, if you're lucky enough, then the response is to withdraw, and develop a social response which is insular, which may build lots of kind of bridging, bonding capital, with people in your locality, but it doesn't actually look very far out. If you have control of the resources, and you know you have control of it directly or as part of a large community group, it I suggest, gives an opportunity for expression. So it's not to say that poverty is alleviated by giving people the resources. If the English give our coal back, then we might be rich, but that's not going to happen. It's too late, that ship has sailed. So the next best thing we can do is say, well, okay, you're not rich, but you know what, that hillside behind your house is yours. You can do what you like with it. You and your friends in your street, you can do what you want with that. And that's the start of a conversation about how people might express themselves to deliver a prosperous city region which allows people to flourish wherever they are and whatever they do, irrespective of whether they're economically valuable. So it's only the first step in a long path, I think. I didn't want to suggest it was a panacea, because it's not.
Okay, who's next? Anyone? Don't be shy, red state.
I would have thought that history would inform the future, and I'm very grateful that up to the age that I've got to now, the stage in our history, that people have cared about their history, that they have left us with something to look forward to the future with from the past. I was very surprised to hear Calvin say, let's stop history, let's move on. Similarly, when you talk about the small picture of each community, somebody has to take the vision, as has been hinted at. You have to have the big picture, and maybe the other pieces of the jigsaw come from the communities. But I think what we're lacking very much sometimes is the vision. So I would want to see a real mix of vision and the smaller picture, but also history as a continuity through to our future.
I agree. I mean, clearly, this slide was deliberately provocative. I don't want to be bound by history. I don't want the hillsides covered in conifers because we used to have pits that required pit props that required wood to keep the pits from collapsing when the pits are gone. And there's a chance to reconfigure a landscape which doesn't require it to look like it did 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And That blank sheet of paper doesn't mean forgetting history. It means being informed by history so you don't make the same mistakes again. I absolutely agree about the overarching vision. I would like to see a Welsh Government which does nothing apart from set the rules, which says, this is how we see welfare, this is how we see the welfare of future generations, these are the ecosystem services approaches we want you to use, other people do it. Yeah? You do it at local level, and you set that visioning framework so that people know what to do and what the rules are effectively.
I'll answer it slightly less philosophically in terms of prosaic lessons that I think we've learned. I mentioned the Eberfach Trail, where people have reflected their history, their cultural history, as you saw through the Guardian statue there, for example. And it is that mix of cultural and natural heritage that we do need to respect and look and use and honour as we go forward into the future, no doubt about that. Interestingly though, all of those community groups that I know, that I work with and other colleagues, for example, within Valleys Regional Park previously, wanted what I might term local control, to be able to do things and to take ownership, to become custodians because they're very proud of their area and it is their area. But they also felt it was necessary to do so within a framework of a bigger vision. And that's where I think, for example, and I'm really biased, I'm going to put my hand up and say I'm really biased, but like the Valleys Regional Park did provide a vision of what was achievable in the valleys, and the communities could see themselves as part of a bigger picture, but a valuable and absolutely necessary part of the jigsaw. So I think we need that combination of big picture frameworks, however we wish to do it, a vision for the future. We have actually got a very dystopic view of what we think the world is going to be like. And Calvin's right, we are going to run out of oil, but we can actually change things around in terms of our energy usage if we wish. And instead of being miserable about it, we can actually probably enjoy it if we really think differently. Sorry, that's right.
Yes, as I say, the false dichotomy that it's them and us, them birds and us people, it's the vision that needs to be shifted towards, in my opinion, is to see us as part of the bigger system. And once we see how we fit into that we're part of that interconnected system, which is the natural world, and we are part of nature, it's not the natural world and we are outside of it, then we can start to make our planning more integrationist, so that we accommodate ourselves and of course the landscape is the product of us in the natural world, and that's where the cultural history lies in the landscape. And it's madness to set that to one side, because we need to appreciate how it evolves over time as we do different things, as we live differently and have different economic lives. And that, I think, the Valleys Regional Park, that great overarching plan that they had, which facilitated local projects, it is a very rich model, I think, for taking this kind of thinking forward and producing real benefits at the end of the day.
Couldn't agree more. And the other thing I would say as well is your attitude to oil changes very much depending on how old you are. So those of us who are my age think the oil will run out. I have a series of children who are around 20. They are afraid the oil won't run out. There'll be enough of it, and therefore people will pull it all out of the ground and kill the earth. I think the real issue there is not whether we've got enough oil or not, but whether we can develop something that isn't oil, that doesn't kill the planet and gives us the energy we need to survive. So I think, that there's a real culture shift there as well. The other thing I would say about the history, we're all proud of the history of Wales and its heavy industrial past, especially down here in the south. And after all, hundreds of thousands of us wouldn't live in Wales if it wasn't for that industrial past. We would all be living in a national park, and there would be very much fear of us. So the history is important. But you all remember as well as I do, your grandfather, parents, depending on your age, how hard it was in those industrial industries, how proud they were of the natural landscape outside of those industries, and how incredibly proud they would be to see it restored. So I think actually all of that historical timeline is really important. And in terms of the vision, I always think that if a politician or a community leader doesn't pass a magic wand test, if I give you a magic wand, what would you make? Then they shouldn't be there. So always ask them, what would they do if they could? Who's next? We've got, I think, time for one more.
Thank you
and thanks to the presenters. Some really interesting ideas. I thought, sorry, Sue Essex. What struck me was from what Calvin and David said in particular. Do we need to start calling these areas rich, which is Mary's ones, instead of labelling them poor? Actually, when you think of the valleys now, what they've become, they've got this richness of the resources around them. And if we start valuing things different, we actually turn the nature of what those communities are, because, as you say, some people would give their eye teeth to have such wonderful areas behind them. So that was the one point. And the second thing was really picking up the localism thing, because it seems to me that the National Assembly is actually going the other way. There's more centralisation and more control than actually freeing up at the localism. And I would have thought perhaps the Assembly reach a maturity point when it doesn't have to say we're going to control everything anymore. We're going to give the framework, as people are saying, but actually trust in our communities more and give them more freedom to actually innovate and do things for themselves.
I always have this thought, and I always say it, I'm not sure I should, but you're right, the centralisation worries me. I think what we need is dissensus, not consensus. Lots of communities trying loads of different things, see what works. And the best time to do that is if somebody else has paid the welfare bill. So if you get it wrong, it doesn't matter, because somebody else is paying the pensions and somebody else is paying the job seeker allowance. That might not last forever. So now is a really good time to cock things up, you know, because some mud might stick, and the mud that sticks might be the mud that you build the future house out of.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, I think, that the communities, as I say, they don't necessarily, they shouldn't be seen in isolation. They don't want to work separately to everybody else. They see themselves as part of a bigger vision, as I say, and to see that maybe communities themselves just need to begin on and do things in their own way. I think they do, but as I say, coming back to this idea that I think politicians and local government and national government institutions should work in harness with communities. It's not about saying, communities, here we go, get on with it yourselves. And actually, because actually it's those communities that make up the national governments and the politicians at the end of the day. They're the people who live there. So, it's not an us and them thing. And we've got a very persuasive narrative in the valleys, unfortunately, that we are poor, and we are, because we saw lots of the issues that I highlighted there, but we're also rich in other ways. And it's about using and valuing those assets differently to create, as I say, and I'm an eternal optimist. I absolutely put my hand up, I'm guilty as charged. But I genuinely believe that if we have a vision for, say, 2050, that we can work with those natural assets, we can turn around the fortunes of the people who live there and people who may live there in the future in terms of coming in. So I am an optimist, guilty as charged.
Yes, so I thought the way you turned the words around, you know, to if we call those communities rich because they're rich in these non-built resources, if you like, that we might change the thinking about it. And it would also help us who are on the planning side of things to think differently about it, to see that richness and to see it as a resource that can be put to use and to deliver on some of the benefits that could knock at least a bit off the need for the welfare and the health budget, and some of those other costs that we saw, and enable people to enjoy the resources that are available. And you know, we don't just have to see a context where you have a relatively small settlement set within an attractive rural context. The idea of the network environment region, it's a very long title, I can't remember all the words now. I think the Cardiff Capital Region as a networked environmental region where the green resources permeate the city and they interact and develop their richness from that. And you know, if we can put more value on those aspects of built development, then I think we will get far more value out of the planning for them at the end of the day, and the investment that's going into the built environment, extend it a little bit, as I said. You really do only need to extend it a little bit, because an awful lot of it is in how you think about things, and therefore how you plan things and design landscapes, design development in landscape contexts to get the rich returns on that investment.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. That's been really stimulating, I think. I've certainly got a lot of food for thought, and many of the panellists, I'm sure, will want to get their point across in other arenas than this. But I would say this, one of the nice things about Wales is it's a really small country, and nearly all of us know somebody who knows somebody else who can get that idea across. So let's take that idea and spread it out there. I like the hope, not despair argument, personally. I think we're probably more or less on the same page, so it's always nice to end an evening like that. So can I just thank the Landscape Institute very much for this evening. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you to host it. And thanks to our three panellists for their really thought-provoking and interesting talks. And can I ask you all to give them a good round of applause for sending them?